Hello, my friends. This is life coach Mike Trugman, and welcome to an episode of Mike's Search for Meaning. I'm after some big questions. Why are we here? What makes a fulfilling life? How can we grow individually and collectively? Each episode, I'll dive deep with leaders who are doing great work in the world and see how they organize their life. Books read, value systems, resources used, and stories that show how each of you can create the life and the world of your dreams. All right, Mike DeSanti, welcome back to Mike's Search for Meaning, and we're both dads, huh? We're both dads since last recording.
Since we've episode one, right? I think it was episode one, and here we are. You're 100 and something deep, and we're both dads, and I would say there's quite a bit to catch up on.
There is, and one of the things to catch up on. And you started a podcast that hasn't, I guess by the time this episode is released, your podcast, Lessons for Luca, will have been released probably. This is about 2 months from now, we're looking at for release date here. And before we jumped on to hit record here, we were debriefing for, 15 minutes or so. And I was just curious, is someone like you, who I really admire as a man who has been really intentional about his worldview, you now have this little tiny boy who eventually is going to be a man, this little tiny being who looks to, among other people, but mostly looks to his mother and father for really everything. Like, what does all of this mean is not a question that he's asking, but he's looking at you all the time and unconsciously thinking, what does this mean? So I'm just curious, as you have started, you've been on this journey as a dad for about 16 months now, and you had the impetus to start this podcast. So what gave you the impetus to start the podcast? And I would love to, from there, we can get into maybe your philosophies and wisdom that you want to impart and all that.
My son, at the time we're recording this, my son is 16 months. But it took my wife and I 3 years to finally get pregnant. So there was this whole like runway. I remember there was a moment when when my wife was finally pregnant. I remember saying to my wife, "Wow, we did all this just to get to the starting line." Like that was in and of itself, it's a whole journey. Then there's this, like, okay, now we have 9 months to prepare and all this. And I remember I had this romantic view of, once my son is born, I'm going to journal and I'm going to document and I'm going to, like, really solidify in time my experience of being a father. And then I became a dad, and it was like a fire hydrant to the face of diapers and priorities and bills and all these everyday concerns that you're like, you're sometimes lucky to just keep your head above water. And I remember saying to my wife, what early fatherhood taught me is there's some days you win and there's some days you just get to the end of. And I remember thinking, like, I thought we were going to win a lot more than we did. So I remember he turned 1, and I was like, I didn't journal and I didn't document all this. And a lot of my romantic concepts were met with the actual, like, on the boots, on the ground experience of fatherhood, which was like, wow, here we are. Like, there's days we're just getting to the end of. And as things leveled off and, routines and things became a little more predictable, there was this part of me and is this part of me that really wants to encapsulate and really secure this moment in time of my philosophy, of my worldview, and to identify it and capture it, via video or podcasts and that medium. And then really, like, that becomes an anthology that I pass on to my son, that when you were born, this is the way your father viewed the world. This is the way he viewed himself. This is the way he viewed masculinity and partnership and husbandhood and all of these things, where, we want to impart onto our children, and sometimes we do it consciously and sometimes we do it unconsciously. But this is like a really intentional way of me saying, okay, when you were born, this is the way uh, I saw the world, what I valued, and what I want you to know, and what I want to pass on to you.
Yeah.
And this will be captured, and you can have it. Now, the other thing is, it could also provide guidance for other men that are going through challenges, or as a man, or as a father, as a husband, just a man in the world, and what does that look like, and what does that mean, and how do we navigate it? So, it's for my son, and more unselfishly, I guess it's for a much broader audience.
I know a lot of men will be served by this conversation and the others that you have about fatherhood. So I want to say here, I have my son is almost 10 months old. And so by the time this episode's released, he'll be about a year old. And I love the idea. The reason we're sitting here together is because I love the idea of my son, Nathan, having also a timestamp that he can look back on and say, well, what types of conversations was my dad having? How did he look at fatherhood when I was 10 months, 1 year old? And the same intention that another dad, one of the things that was really hard for me when I became a new dad was that I I didn't feel like there were other candid conversations out there about what it was like. And a lot of the things I heard were about being a really supportive partner to my wife, which of course is really important. But I had a really hard time navigating my own personal experience. And like you, I romanticized a lot of what fatherhood was going to be like and thought only about the amazing things that were going to happen. For example, and it's interesting, I wanted to pick your brain about what you romanticize, because my romanticization was, if that's the right word, it had nothing to do with when he was an infant or a newborn. I was fast forwarding to like cooking healthy meals with him in the kitchen and taking him to the park and whatever. I wasn't attached to what he was interested in, but following along with his hobbies and being along for the ride, whether it was something in the arts or if he liked playing sports or if he was creative, like really taking a genuine interest in his world. I certainly wasn't thinking about the diaper changing, the sleepless nights, things like that. So I'm curious, what you romanticized is one question that I have. And then I'm curious, as you stepped into your reality, who did you start to become, and or what identities were you maybe letting go of? Like, I really feel like fatherhood's a rite of passage.
Yeah, what I didn't, I guess I romanticized having more energy.
Mm.
And I think broader, that was more, that I was, this element of presence and patience, and all those things are a lot harder to tap into when you're exhausted. And you and I were, before we were recording, where I was telling you that my son didn't sleep for 13 months. He didn't sleep through the night. So like we were constantly dealing with this huge consideration, where other parents were, their kids were sleeping at 3 months or at 5 months. And, here we are on his first birthday, and we're like, we still haven't slept. Like we were really like, I feel like psychologically just deteriorating.
Hmm.
Uh, so I think I romanticized having more energy sooner. And then all the challenges that came along with that, of keeping my patience and staying present, and being a good partner, like you said. I think that was something that we didn't foresee, and that was a consideration and a challenge that we didn't necessarily know we were going to be facing daily. When we were waking up in the morning and we were like, tonight's sleep can't come fast enough, like we were definitely on some fumes. That was one thing that was a challenge. Now, that being said, there was this opportunity where I think for me it was a matter of like really distinguishing what am I experiencing, and in the frustrations of being a father, a husband, and a parent. I distinguish those three things.
Mm.
I think there, fatherhood, is me and my son Luca. Parenthood is me, my wife, and our son. And then there's husbandhood, which is just me and my wife.
Mm.
So it's like, how do we keep those three buckets full? How do we, make sure that, all of those dynamics are being met? It's like, if let's say if my husband cup feels empty, being told I'm a really great father isn't filling that husband cup. It's filling my father cup. And so like that communication with my wife was something that I thought we really needed to polish. And in that whole like navigating of those three cups, I started to find myself like there were certain things like feeling appreciated or not appreciated or having patience or losing patience. I started to understand about myself. So much of that was actually like my own history, my own point of origin, was my own adaptations from like watching my parents and picking up on their dynamics. And then it was like, well, how do I, pause some of that polluted river so it doesn't go downstream to my son? And then how do I be as intentional and deliberate of like teaching him and showing him exactly what I want him to know about his father? And that's not so, upstream from unconsciously upstream from what was going on. So there was a lot in early fatherhood that I really needed to distinguish of like, okay, this isn't just this moment in time. This is actually some reflexive stuff too from my own history and personal story and point of origin that I get to clean up here. And a lot of the cleanup, I'll say, Mike, was like communicating effectively with my wife and owning my state and saying like, hey, you know what, like right now I'm feeling underappreciated, and that's not to say that you don't appreciate me. And those were huge things for me to like come to an awareness, because like my wife appreciates me probably more than anyone in the world. But I would have these experiences like, I feel underappreciated right now. But here's the thing, that's not on her. That was on me. And to like my son and becoming a dad really allowed me and forced me to like see my own state and own my own state, and then be able to communicate that and say, wait, this is mine. This isn't yours. This is mine. This isn't ours. And as I communicated that, it would help, my dynamic with my wife would help me unravel some of that old, upstream pollution.
Mm-hmm. So many things. Let's see if I can track all of them. So one is, I love this distinction, the three different buckets of being a husband, being a father, and being a parent. I never thought of it quite that way, that there's a different dynamic between being the father to your son and being a co-parent or being a parent. How do you look at the distinction between both of the, like being a father and being a parent? Like maybe an example of what's something that fills up your father bucket that feels distinct from your parent bucket?
I mean, father bucket is really, it's my relationship solo with my son.
Mm-hmm.
It's our dynamic. It's our time together alone. It's the way like your son is going to look at you and your son's going to look at your wife differently. And different and special doesn't mean better. It just means distinct. And I think it's important that we nurture that distinction. Like when my son looks at my mom, when my son looks at his mom, it's like there's such a deep affection and like a nurturing and just like, oh my God, you're my world. And then when he looks at me, it's like, oh, we're about to have fun. We're about, like, and it's different. It's just distinct. And it's not better. It's special. It's different. It's distinct. And I think that needs to be encouraged. And then there is the parent dynamic, which is, you had said earlier, like my son is building his worldview right now. And 99% of the time he's looking to me and his mom. And so that parent dynamic has so much to do with just simply the way my wife and I talk to each other, the way we interact, the way we are when we're side by side, the way we are when the three of us are in a room together. That's absolutely powerful and important, because you think of it this way, Mike, there's most of communication is nonverbal. We know
Mm-hmm.
that, right? Like most of it is not what I'm saying, but how I'm saying it. It's my tone, it's my attitude, it's the spirit that I do it in, it's my inflection, it's my pace, my volume. So that's most of communication is nonverbal. But there's my when my son is his age, before language, that's pre-verbal. So that means like my son's really just picking up vibes. That's
Yeah.
like our nervous system's communicating. That's him just picking up the energy in the room, the way my nervous system is, the way his mom's is, like, and he's just picking up all of this from the way that we are with each other. And so the way that I speak with my wife, the way that she speaks with me, my son's picking all that up. The way that I look at her, the way that I treat her, the way that, we support each other, the way that we laugh. Like laughter's a big, big pillar in my house. It's like before my son is able to speak, I mean, his vocabulary is like 10 words long at this point, but he's learning constantly. But he's really learning about really from that parenting dynamic. And that's the way that we treat each other. That's the way that we are together. That's the way that we are as what I call a nucleus.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the nucleus of my world is my wife and my son. So the way that I am individually with him, the way that I am individually with his mom, and the way that we are together, all of that matters.
Mm-hmm.
Those are really like cups that really need to be filled and replenished daily and weekly.
Mm. I have a two-part question about feeling underappreciated, which is a big one for me. And for people who are tuned in, I'm sure you're familiar with the five love languages. Words of affirmations, my biggest. Is words of affirmation your biggest? This isn't the question I was going to ask, but there's words
It's
of
evolved,
affirmation.
it's evolved over time. It used to be words for sure, and I think it's gone more into physical touch and quality time. I would say now, but it's evolved. It's
Uh-huh.
evolved. Yeah,
Well,
words
there's,
used to be big for me. Now it's quality time and touch.
gotcha. With feeling underappreciated, there's a lot of dynamics about that. So I'm curious, the nervous system is a really good, like that's such a powerful visual of how you're communicating vibe wise. Your nervous system is communicating so much with Luca's, and for me, my nervous system with Nathan's. So when you're feeling underappreciated, what's happening? How are you able to notice that in a way? Because I know a lot of people who would feel that way, the knee jerk reaction is to demand it and beg for it, and it react in some way that is going to probably perpetuate the pattern. So I guess the two part is, what do you notice, and
Mm.
what has the cleanup been like for you?
So what I notice is a lot of my personal history, I think, comes down to impatience. Like if someone's not patient with me, I feel like unloved or
Mm.
unappreciated or underappreciated. I will distinguish, like I've never felt unappreciated, but there's sometimes that I felt underappreciated. Like I'm making all this effort, I'm doing all this work, and then it's like, oh man, I could just, use a hug right now or
Mm.
So I think for me, the point of origin for me is that's like the dynamic that I grew up in, where my parents didn't have a lot of patience for each other.
Mm.
And so there's a lot of times where I'm like, like again, if we didn't sleep for 13 months, I mean, who's going to have patience at that point? So the knee jerk reaction is to like finger point and put it on someone else, like the finger point and put it on my wife. But if I have an ounce of empathy, I'd be like, well, my wife hasn't slept in a year. How could I sit here and expect her to be patient? So the cleanup is really around, for me, it's about ownership. It's about owning my state and saying like, okay, when this happens, this is what I'm experiencing. And that doesn't put it on her. It keeps it on me to say like, hey, this is what I'm noticing. And if there's any way that we could prevent it, or if there's any way we could clean it up and repair it, then let's do it. Otherwise, let's move on to the next. Let's just acknowledge it, and then we move on to the next moment. And that way, what's happened, by owning my own state, I don't harbor resentments. I don't harbor, tension between us. We acknowledge the reality. We're both tired. We're both doing the best we can. And I'm not going to put my state on anyone else. Number one, that disempowers me. And number two, that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on someone that I love more than anything in the world. And then now I'm putting pressure on an already very, very challenging situation. So the repair is really in consciously acknowledging it, owning my state in it. And if there's any way that we can make some future promise or commitment, hey, going forward, I'm gonna do better in, being more patient. I'll do better with staying more grounded. I'll do better with, not whatever, being on the phone or putting
Yeah.
that on you. Like just own the moment, own your state, and then, you know, clean it up and make a new promise or commitment and go forward.
Hmm.
What that does too is it puts a period in the paragraph rather than making it like the rest of the story here.
Hmm. I love that. I want to get into your philosophy, but before that, I think there's probably men who are listening to this right now who are thinking that sounds really great. And also, like, what are some tools or ways that you're able to distance yourself when you're in the heat of the moment? It could be really hard. So there's, I guess, another two-parter. I have a tendency for this. There's the in the moment, like what are maybe the specific things that you're saying? Are you taking a pause? Are you taking 5 minutes to go gather yourself? Are you going to scream into a pillow? So that's in the moment. Those are all things that I do sometimes, by the way. And the what if you're not sleeping consistently for 13 months, I'm thinking, how are you able to take care of yourself? What were you making sure that you were able to do if you weren't sleeping?
Yeah. I mean, I'll go backwards on that. I think, like before my son, I was, I still am like super health conscious and, was in the gym 5 days a week. And I eat a very high standard of health, of food, of exercise, of being an early fatherhood, that schedule changes quite a bit. So for me, the biggest thing was something's better than nothing.
Hmm.
There was no way I was going to keep and maintain my old schedule of training as hard as I used to train, and then remember go through the night and not sleep. Like my central nervous system was deteriorating at that point. So the big goal was something is better than nothing. No zeros, no goose eggs.
Hmm.
So what I call that too is I call that outlets over outcomes. Like something's better than nothing. So if the only outlet I have is a walk around the block, I'll take it. If the only outlet I have right now is, do 20 push-ups because I got to be somewhere in a minute and a half, that's better than zero. So outlets over outcomes. If you don't have outlets, you start to obsess over outcomes and you always feel powerless or anxious. Outlets are just like the spigot that you let some of that energy out. Um, the other part of your question is just, don't sweep things under the rug. So even if, I had a moment where I lost my patience, if I had a moment where, you know, things kind of went haywire, bring it up proactively. Hey, I've been thinking about this morning. Hey, I've been thinking about yesterday. Hey, you know what? I noticed is like a theme that I'm feeling and going through. Don't expect your partner to read your mind and heart because you didn't marry a fortune teller. You married a human. And I'll ruin the ending for you that there's no perfect partner, there's no perfect parent, there's no perfect kid. So your ability to proactively bring things up and effectively communicate it is a superpower.
Yeah.
Expecting someone to read your, inner world absolute mishap of your energy. It's just you're going to be completely inaccurate. So your our ability to proactively bring it up and say, "Hey, listen, this is what I'm experiencing. I've been thinking about this morning. I've been thinking about yesterday. I want to proactively bring that up. I don't want to wait to bring that up. And I proactively bring it up, and then I also own my participation in it. This is my state. This is what I'm experiencing. And then what I call clearing it is, now that I've owned my participation in it, I have a commitment as I go forward that I'm going to be more of this or less of that. And so now I make a future promise in that state. So there's people call it a repair or a clearing, and there's a psychological component to that that's not only important in partnership, it's also important in parenting, because it allows us to really engage with each other's humanness and not each other's perfection
Mm,
or each other's pedestal. Like if I put my wife on a pedestal, or my wife puts me on a pedestal, then there's only one place to go, and that's south, that's down. But if we engage in each other's humanness, we acknowledge, like, I'm going to make mistakes, I'm going to be imperfect, you're going to do the same. Let's not layer that. Let's clean it up as fast as we can and go on to the new moment. There's this. I have a gentleman in one of my masterminds. He told me this great story. We was talking about, like, layering these resentments and layering these micro tensions. And he had this great story about someone he grew up with in the neighborhood was a hoarder, and what she hoarded, interesting enough, was rugs. And she would just lay rugs on top of rugs on top of rugs. And then she ran out of so much space, like she would layer these rugs on the second floor. Now, one rug, so what? But then two rugs, four rugs, eight rugs, 16. The weight got so heavy that it brought the second floor down. It collapsed it. And that's what we do with resentments and these
yeah.
tensions. It's like when we don't clear them, you're just stacking them on top of each other. And you're not, we're not acknowledging our humanness. We're not acknowledging, like, we're going to make mistakes. We're not acknowledging how challenging parenthood is and how we're going to be impatient. We're going to lose our temper and we're going to lose our shit from time to time. Like, that's going to happen. Best thing we do is clear it as quick as possible.
Yeah.
So the next moment, you're not just layering a rug on top of a rug on top of a rug. And then all of a sudden you're like, how did the second floor break? Well, I don't know. Have you counted how many rugs you've layered? There's 300 of them. Well, they get heavy over time.
I swear to you, Mike, if people just left with that realization that being a good partner, being a good parent, being a good dad is really about catching the rugs before they stack up too high. Just like, hey,
Totally.
I'm on the first or second or third rug here right now, and the word that was coming to mind for me was revealing. Like if I
Yeah,
could be candid about what my experience is, and also not attached to it being right, but rather this is just what's happening for me over here, right?
exactly.
It's
Yeah.
it's really, it amazes me, even when a lot of times between me and my wife, if it's something that I perceive as something that will be really hurtful for me to say, if I say it in a way that isn't actually blaming her or antagonistic, like I'll tell a personal example of a story because I think it really clicks in here. There was one time that Nathan threw up, and we had never seen a baby throw up before. I'm not sure if Luca has, but it was really scary. Like he projectile vomited big time, and we took him to the hospital, and that in and of itself was this big source of tension because I was utterly convinced that it wasn't a good idea to go to the hospital, that he was
Mm.
fine, and that there was nothing. If we just let him go to bed, it was bedtime on a Friday night, that he probably would have been totally fine, and we didn't need to go through the trouble of going to a hospital. And my wife was not in a position to talk about that. She immediately was like, we got to go right away to the hospital. We didn't even dress him. We didn't put clothes on, anything. We just went right to the hospital. And for the better part, we were probably there for a total of 4 hours. For the better part of the first two, I don't know if I said a single word. but other than addressing a nurse if they came over, or a person that needed to be communicated with. But between my wife and I, no words spoken. And I didn't say anything that whole time because I was in this shutdown mode, really holding in my anger. And you could call that, the rugs were stacking really fast. I can't believe we're here. He's totally fine. Everyone's looking at us like we're crazy for bringing him to hospital. Like, it's really just rug after rug,
Yeah.
building a case for how right I was. And my wife eventually was like, the only thing that's more hurtful than being here, being really scared and being worried, is the way that you're shutting me out right now.
Is your silence.
Is your silence. And I said, I'm being silent because I'm scared that if I opened my mouth right now, I would say something that would be really hurtful. And I actually don't want to share the exact words I said, but they could be perceived as very, very, very hurtful. But I said them with, I'm having the thought that, and then I said that,
Yeah.
not I'm thinking of whatever, or I want to, or, so, and it's so weird that moment was really connecting, actually, that I revealed myself, I revealed my experience. This is what's happening for me. And we actually ended up having a pretty decent time the rest of the time in the hospital. It's really interesting. Like we actually have a couple of fond and fun memories of being there after I decided to share what was going on. So
right. Yeah.
It's incredible just being able to share that.
It's interesting too, because it's strange, but that actually builds intimacy.
It does.
It is that vulnerability, that honesty, that transparency, like dropping that veil that I need to be perfect, or I need to like build my case like you're an attorney or something in this relationship, which is so strange. It's so funny. A really fascinating perspective is your marriage mostly takes place in your head.
Yes.
Your marriage with your partner is mostly like imagination. It's like most of it is actually like unspoken in your. And then I'm going to say this, and then I'm going to do it. I'm like, no, none of that's reality, man. It's all imagination. And there's two things. I really love what you're saying, because it actually reminded me of something I think that ties in with early fatherhood. Is my wife and I were on a walk. Like we would do, that was an outlet of ours. We would walk around the block a lot. We would walk around the neighborhood at the end of the day, and we would debrief the day. And this, like, it was actually confusing and strange for me that I was like, where is this underappreciation? Where does it come? What is it? It's not the surface. It's not the reality. And I remember being on this walk with my wife saying, what I'm experiencing is this feeling of underappreciation, and I know how much you appreciate me. And so I've really like thought back on my parents and their dynamic and growing up, and I remember watching my father work really hard, and I remember my mom, doing so much around the house, and for like really like my parents were just always stretched thin, but they never like acknowledged it with each other. And I was like, and so like that was like the water I swam in, right? Like that was just, I normalized that you're supposed to, as a parent or as a partner, always supposed to be like a threshold away of like breaking. And now eventually my parents, their marriage did break. So like that just almost solidified it for me. So I remember having this walk around the the neighborhood with my wife, and I was like, "Wow, like this is what's coming up for me, and this is what I'm experiencing, and this isn't you, this is me." And on top of communicating that experience, a valuable thing to do is then propose a solution to it. So like, okay, I'm experiencing all this. I don't know how you're going to reconcile that. This is all me, but here's my solution to it. And this is the simple solution that in early parenthood, I was like, it's really important that we say please and thank you to each other. Like, it was so funny. Like, if my wife was like in the thick of it, changing a diaper, and she's like, grab me a diaper. If she didn't say please, I'd be like, I'd go back to like 4-year-old Michael. And I was like, oh my God, here's the diaper. Okay. Like, I know you're like shoulder deep here. And I'm like, it's not about her. This is my own thing. This is my own thing. But here's the thing is like owning that experience and then saying like, here's the solution. Very simple. I think we got to prioritize saying please and thank you. What are your thoughts on that? And my wife's like, oh, yeah, that's easy. And then what started to happen is like, instead of stacking those micro tensions, it created intimacy, it created partnership, it created teamwork. And like, here's like this wound in me, which is my wound. It's not my wife's. It's also not my wife's to fix.
Yeah.
It's mine to own and then mine to communicate. And so like watching my parents be so spread thin and not acknowledge each other, there's a fear of me is like, I don't want that to happen to us. I love my wife more than anything. So like, how do we make sure that this unit stays strong and then stays strong, which only benefits our son? How do we do that? All right, simple solution. Make sure we keep saying please and thank you. Make sure we make time for each other. Make sure we carve out, what's important to you, what's important to me. And so that was one strategy we used. And the other strategy we used was we would do like we would do check-ins, and I was always ask like, "What's your number? Where are you right now?" I'm a 7 out of 10. All right, cool. I can make up your 3. No problem. I'm a 6. I'm a 5. Anything below 5 was like, all right, why don't you do what you got to do? Like I'll figure it out, right? And so we would check in with each other and be like, all right, where are you right now? And what that would do is that would give us a gauge for how to navigate of like, I don't expect you to be a 10. And I also don't expect like this is 50-50. Like, okay, you need to be this all the time and I need to be this all the time. Or, listen, I handled all my priorities. You need to figure it out. Like, no, I get to extend here. I get to, to go out of my range a bit here temporarily. Nothing's permanent. But the ability to communicate that and say, okay, I can make up some slack here, that's valuable rather than just assume like, oh, she should be fine, he should be fine. Like, that's not always the case. Like, everyone's dealing with different considerations and circumstances. So you got to communicate that. That was another skill and tool that we used, especially early on.
They're both amazing. And I know it can be really easy to dismiss who am I to ask for please and thank you? It's not a big deal or whatever, but it takes a lot of humility to be willing to ask for that. And just before we get into your worldview, philosophies, wisdom you want to impart, there have been many times, especially in the months where Nathan wasn't sleeping, that my wife and I were both below a 5. Let's just say on a check-in, one of us could have been a 2 and the other might have been a 2 or a 3. What was helpful in moments like that, if you were in moments like that?
It's if I could broaden that a bit, just like a 30,000-foot view, I have a philosophy of relationship or of marriage or partnership where typically or marriage and intimate relationships are a dance between togetherness and individuality. And usually one person values and leans more towards individuality and one person values and leans more towards togetherness. So to distinguish that, I call one the sovereign and one the romantic. The romantic values togetherness and the sovereign values individuality. And the challenge of that is that they're both important. But in moments of stress and conflict, the sovereign tends to want space and the romantic tends to want a hug. So if you don't identify who's who, the sovereign is like, I need 10 minutes. And as the sovereign's walking away, the romantic's like, let's hug it out. And it creates more and more friction because you're like, just give me 10 minutes. And then, so at the deeper part of that, the unconscious wound of the romantic is the fear of abandonment. And the unconscious wound of the sovereign is the fear of loss of self. And so, like, oh my God, this is getting too much. Who am I? I'm losing who I am. And the sovereign starts to go into this kind of frozen dynamic of like, I'm out of here. And then the romantic is like you're pulling away. I need you to communicate. Let's talk this out. If we don't understand that, it becomes really, really challenging in our communication.
Yeah.
So in those times of a 2 or a 3 or a 4 or anything below a 5, to know if my if your partner is the sovereign, like, give them time alone, give them time to chill, give them time to step away. They're
Mm-hmm.
not leaving you, they're not abandoning you, they're not being insensitive. They need time to reorganize and recalibrate. And then if it's like, hey, I need a hug, I just need to be told I'm doing, I'm acknowledged, I'm appreciated. You realize I'm doing, recognize I'm doing I'm doing the best I can. Like, I need to hear that from time to time. That's the romantic needs that. If you could understand that in those times of 2s, we'll call it, if the sovereign can say, I love you, you're amazing, I know you're doing the best you can, I need 10 minutes, both needs get met. Both values get addressed. If the romantic can say, I know you're stressed out, why don't you take 20? I'm good. We're fine. Let's reconvene at 20 minutes from now or even tomorrow. We're going to be fine. If you can communicate that and just kind of know what each other values, you'll probably dodge 80% of most conflicts.
It's so good. It feels like if you get to know your own instruction manual and just
Yeah.
give it to your partner, it eliminates a lot of the drama of the relationship.
You've got to you've got to communicate your blueprint of how to love and be in relationship with you.
Mm.
And here's the thing, most romantics marry sovereigns. And they're like, I don't get it. Why aren't we hugging this out? It's like that because that's not what I value right now. But if we could understand that and you have a blueprint and then you can communicate that, you'll avoid 80% of conflicts. Because here's the thing. This is just my philosophy. Marriages don't end due to lack of love. Marriages end due to miscommunication.
Mm-hmm.
And if you miscommunicate, what we're mostly miscommunicating is what we value. Well, here's the thing is if you don't understand your own state, own your own state, and then communicate your own state, how is your partner going to know it? How's your partner going to understand it? How's your partner going to navigate it? We've got to give a blueprint to each other of how to love us and be in relationship with us. And so much of that is really communicating what we value. And then also understanding is that what you value and what other people value may not be the same thing. So to know that and then effectively communicate it is massive.
Yeah. This feels like a good segue to go into. I imagine if you were to parse through masculine energy, feminine energy, that sovereign is a masculine energy. It doesn't have to be the man partner, but it's a masculine energy.
Yeah.
And the romantic would be a feminine energy. And again, that could be, the male partner can have, or even
Yeah.
in a gay partnership, there's always a polarity and a tension that I see in relationships.
Yeah.
Like for sure, I identify more with the sovereign who under duress needs to get away time and collect myself for 20 minutes. And my wife would want to handle it together and
Yeah.
more of the romantic. So one of the things that you...
My marriage, that's probably reversed.
Interesting. Yeah.
I'm probably lean more towards a romantic in my marriage. And my wife would be probably more of the sovereign. And those evolve and change.
Yes.
Different dynamics, different roles, different seasons of life. So it's like, it's almost like, I think when we heal those aspects of us, and You put in what's needed,
Yeah.
right? Like in my book, I talk about like, what is this moment calling forth from me?
Hmm.
Sometimes it calls forth the sovereign. Sometimes it calls forth the romantic. Sometimes it calls forth the hammer. Sometimes it calls forth the rose. Sometimes it calls forth logic and analysis and rationale. And sometimes it calls forth like creativity and openness and vulnerability and faith and trust. Every moment is a new moment. So if what's the saying? If all you have is a hammer, everything's going to look like a nail. You got to be dynamic, and you got to see like, well, hold on, what is this moment calling forth from me? What do I get to put in here? Do we need to diffuse this a little bit with a little bit of space and time? Go ahead, take it. Do we need to? Hey, hold on, we're ignoring something here. Like, let's address it. Let's huddle up. And so that calls forth a greater dynamicness of us. I think up until now, um, we could get away with being one dimensional. You could
Yeah.
get away with, like, oh, well, this is my role and you need to figure your, like, I don't know, maybe we got away with it. Maybe we thought we got away with it, but it was actually more traumatic and harmful in our marriages and partnership and parenthood the last few decades. But I think there is this new call to being dynamic, that I could simultaneously be logical and operate with reason and commitment and discipline, while at the same time be open and vulnerable and have faith and trust and be creative. Those aren't like one is better than the other. Those get to be harmonized in us. So there's that on the individual level, and then there's also that on the partnership level, and then there's also that on the parenting level. So it's this constant, what is this moment calling forth from me? And if I don't have access to that, and my inner world is completely chaotic, in times of stress, we tend to go to not what's healthy, but what's familiar. So for you, if what's familiar is like, I'm going to shut down here due to an old, trauma survival response, then that might be ineffective. In a hospital with a sick kid and your wife is looking, that might be ineffective. And then your ability to shift that is what creates that intimacy.
Yes. Spoiler alert, it might be ineffective. Let's upgrade that. It was highly ineffective, not
Massively ineffective, right?
massively ineffective.
Well, I think too is, using your example and maybe older, actually, I'll say this, in my history of relationships, I was absolutely the sovereign. So for me to even go to that example that I told you, like for me, having that walk around the neighborhood and saying to my wife, like, whoa, this is what I'm experiencing. The old me would have shut that down, never expressed it, had my guard up, not
Mm.
even for a moment dropped my armor. Uh, that would be the old me. So, being in a partnership where that's not only like accepted, but encouraged, that's a muscle for me to work. And now I see the importance of being that romantic. But my history, that is not so.
Yeah. Well, you started to get into a little bit about, like you mentioned your book, New Man Emerging. I think it's very timely still. And I believe you wrote it 5 years ago. Yeah, 2019.
I think it's 2019 it was published. Yeah. So yeah, 5 years. Oh my God.
And it's in a lot of ways, this is my interpretation of the book, which I read much closer to when it was released. I probably read it in 2020. Shout out Find Your Tribe OG, right?
OJ. Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
That's when I read it. So it was beginning of 2020. Was really a calling. We're talking about what's being called forth of men and the masculine today. And I think a lot of the principles are that you spoke about then are very timely still now. But we were talking about this being a snapshot of a conversation, an anthology for you want to anthologize kind of your worldview, where you're at right now, so that one day Luca will be able to look back on this and that other fathers, other people who are curious about this type of thing can learn too. I'm curious, what do you feel is being called forth from the masculine right now in your life as a father?
In a snapshot of that, I think that the call the call for masculinity now is the jump or leap from being one-dimensional to being dynamic. And to be one-dimensional, I think we've gotten away with that for a long time. It's, whatever you want to look at, being one-dimensional is the I provide and that's it. Or I'm successful here and that's it. And being successful in this one domain in life should overflow and fill up all the other cups of my life, all the other domains of my life. And I think what we're called for now is to say, like, okay, that leap from being one dimensional to be dynamic is to actually say that all the domains of my life, all the things in my life that require love and attention, receive the appropriate amount. That I could be dynamic enough that I provide financially, spiritually, emotionally to my family. I also nurture my friendships and my relationships. I also look after my health. I also prioritize my downtime, leisure time, hobby time. I also, address, a deeper sense of spiritual life. That we can not have everything. Like, I can't do everything, but I can do anything.
Yeah.
And the opportunity to say, like, okay, I boil down and I distill down my attention and my focus and my energy, and I put it to things that are priority and that matter. And that requires a whole different that requires a whole different harmony of us. That it is the harmonizing of my head and my heart, my logical state and my emotional state, that I have access to my emotional state, that I have access to what I feel and what I'm experiencing. If you think of the cultural narratives for men and masculinity, is, just one simple one of, like, never let them see you cry. Men don't cry. Well, if you don't cry, crying is simply your body's way of giving you information to what you care about.
Mm.
Okay, so go ahead and cut that off and cut all that information off, cut off all that emotionality, all that passion, all that creativity, all that expression. So cut that half of your power off, and then just go live in your head and just go operate life like it's some anxious chess match. That is not a fulfilling way of living. A fulfilling way of living is really harmonizing my head and my heart, having access to all that information through my emotionality, through my feeling, through my past experience, and then organizing it with my logical mind. Okay, that's what this looks like. That's how I'm going to use this. That's how I'm going to express this. That's how I'm going to alchemize this into something effective, useful, something of contribution, something that's prosperous. And so I think that's a deeper call for us now. Is the old expression, that Native American expression, the longest journey a man will ever make is only 14 inches from their head to their heart. So, like, how do I not choose one or the other, but how do I harmonize the two? And so I think what we're navigating now, that I write about in my book, now that you mentioned it 5 years ago, is, it's not just this option of, okay, just go be some stone cold, shut off, masculine, like shut down, non-emotional, like kind of John Wayne archetype of nothing affects me, to the opposite end of the spectrum, which is like just this, like, people pleasing, emotional, no regulation, like overly sensitive, like, pool of emotion on the floor, man, that just gets stepped on. I think there's a dynamic man that lives in that balance of the in between, that knows when to access head and knows when to access heart, knows when to access the hammer, and knows when to access the rose. And so much of that is actually our own personal healing of our history, of our relationships with our parents, and the wounds that we get to figure out and heal from our own upbringing, from our cultural upbringing. So I think that's really the jump, the leap, the healing from going from one dimensional to dynamic.
That's beautiful, man. I was having the thought before cutting off your emotions, not crying, only being one dimensional, that's a really, really supercharged one-way ticket to stacking up rugs. To stick with that analogy, man. Like if you're cutting yourself off in all of those ways, there is going to be a lot of unresolved stuff that is clogging up your energy.
It,
And
it's exactly I call them obstructions.
yeah,
It's a great way to put it. They just clog up your energy. They obstruct your energy. They obstruct any sort of creative channel. They obstruct your presence. They just clog it up, like you said. And then I'm supposed to live some deeper, meaningful, fulfilling life that way. Like it's an impossibility.
it's a big ask too. So I want to honor, like, I feel like I'm walking my path, and what you're saying about being not just what historically was called for from a man, being the provider and hoping that that overflows into all other domains of your life, that you're providing emotionally, spiritually, you're taking care of your health, your creativity, like really in all domains of your life, making sure that whatever needs attending to is being attended to. I'm curious, for men who are listening who struggle, let's just pick one or two that men typically struggle with, which would probably be emotionality. Well, let's just say emotionality, spirituality, and creativity. That those in some ways are either being shut off or just totally denied in the first place. Like I never for most of my life thought that creativity had any import on my health, my well-being, my ability to show up as a father, as a partner. But they
Right.
but they matter a lot. So if we look at them, I like your distinction between outcomes and having on ramps. And so for men who are like just introducing themselves to this, or want to take a little bit of a deeper dive, and what's like the 5 minute or less on ramp that you could give into those domains?
If a lot of my philosophy is broken down into three distinctions of life, which I call point of origin, point of presence, and point of power. And so, point of origin is really our personal history. It's all the things that we build our worldview on, and it's all the things that gunk up. What you say? They clog up the energy, they clog up the pipes. But that's that's inevitable. Like your son, my son, they are building their worldview right now, and there's certain things that they're going to conclude, and that's going to clog them up, and that's their journey. They get to figure that out. So there is no let me blast into my future with this great point of power without actually checking in, like point of origin, like what is blocking upstream here,
Mm-hmm.
like what's upstream that's polluting where I am now. A huge part of opening up those channels of creativity is you got to do some point of origin work.
Yeah.
You've got to. There's just no way around it. Now, don't go unpack and live there and be a victim to your history, but you got to look at some point of origin work of like, where did I form these conclusions of I'm supposed to be this way, men are supposed to be this way, fathers, husbands, you name it, are supposed to be this way. And what you find here, and this is a massive journey of authenticity, is that there are points of our history through either life defining events or life defining dynamics where we self abandoned. That, let's say, there's two sons, and one is like, I don't know, the archetype of masculinity of like, he's the jock, he's the sports guy, he gets all the girls, he's fit, he's all that, right? He fits the mold. And then let's say his brother is artistic and creative and sensitive and X, Y, or Z. And the parent maybe innocently of like, hey, listen to the younger brother, like, I need you to survive in this world. I need you to be more like your brother. All of a sudden, that young boy is going to conclude like, who I am, the way I am is not enough. And so therefore, I will put on a facade, I'll put on a persona, I'll put on an archetype, I'll put on an image to be more of what you keep telling me I should be.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is you start to use a little bit of Carl Jung's philosophy in this is that there's persona and there's self. And then as we increase the sense of persona or image, we decrease a sense of self and authenticity.
Mm.
And so now in order for that young boy to be more of like his brother or be more of what his parents keep telling him he should be, he's got to abandon a sense of self. So he's got to now suppress creativity or suppress his sensitivity or suppress his deeper passions of creativity or whatever makes him come alive to fit some mold that innocently his parents told him he should be more of. And so now I'm living with this. I don't know why do I met this standard. I accomplished this. I became successful. I met the archetype. I met the persona. I met the image. How am I lonelier? Now, this is what I think a lot of men are facing, especially a lot of successful men, is I checked all the boxes. I became everything you told me I should be. I followed that map of what it means to be successful. I got the house, I got the woman, I got the kids, I got the car, I got the picket fence, I got it all. I got the status. Why am I feeling lonely? Why do I feel lost? Why do I feel empty? Well, because in order to achieve that level of persona, you had to abandon a sense of self. And so the journey of authenticity is just recalibrating all of that. And so, maybe it went a little longer than 5 minutes for your question, but I've got to go back into my point of origin and see, like, where did I self-abandon? Where did I put down the things that made me come alive because someone I trusted or respected told me I should be more or less of something? And so what happens is now by abandoning a sense of self, I actually unconsciously in that sense of self-abandonment, that's actually where we hide and we house our shame.
Yes.
That who I am is fundamentally wrong or broken or flawed. And in order to be happy and joyful and successful and fulfilled, I got to be more of this or less of that. And then I concluded, well, I don't know. My parents told me that. My rabbi told me that. My priest told me that. Society told me that. So therefore, who I am as I am is not enough. So I got to be more of this or less of that. And then talk about stacking rugs. We just stack that on top of stack that on top of stack. And then and then here's the thing is we actually get it. We get that mountaintop. We get that summit. We get that success. We get that accomplishment. And you're like, oh my God, that lasted 15 minutes. Now what? And now it's like, how do I reconcile all that? I just spent all my life chasing money or fame or status or the relationship or whatever. And now I got it. And oh no, that just lasted 15 minutes. And now I feel just as lost. Uh-oh. What have I been doing with my life? So a lot of my coaching, a lot of my philosophy is like, okay, now how do we recalibrate that your authenticity and your persona are actually aligned? That who you are, what you think, how you express, how you emote, what you do, what you're passionate about, what your purpose is actually in alignment. And that to me is a much deeper, meaningful, fulfilling way of living.
Me too, brother. What I'm hearing, the shorthand, the quick one-liner summation of what you just shared is that when you are your authentic self, when your authentic self is aligned with the way that you move through and be and operate in the world, that creativity, emotionality, after that cleanup has been taken care of, and it's constant work, I don't want to say after, but if that's being tended to, then more and more of there's going to be almost a natural expression of fulfillment and aliveness, right? That we are, this is something that I believe, that we're fundamentally creative, dynamic, spiritual, emotional, everything beings, and that, like you so beautifully, and I'm glad you went more than 5 minutes because that was so fucking powerful. It was really, really meaningful to hear that. And I've heard you speak about these topics a bunch, but it still, I don't know, it hits a little bit differently as a father, that it just feels so important to me, and this is where I wanted to go with you in shaping this little tiny pre-verbal being, that we are, to me, what feels most essential, I wanted to pick your brain on this, what feels most essential is me nurturing who he really is. And in a way, like, yes, modeling leadership and like giving him guideposts and boundaries, and, you know, look both ways when you cross the street, of course. And like, you know, taking baseline, we're doing what we can to make him safe, and also taking baseline that I'm a human and I'm going to fuck up and make mistakes and project all of that. I think the most important role as a parent and as a father is to nurture who Nathan is. Do you feel the same way?
I call that what divine essence.
Mm.
What I mean by divine essence is, now that you're a father, I always ask fathers, like, what did your son do to earn your love? Like, what did he do?
Yeah, and you want me to answer? He existed. He existed.
He did nothing. He was born. He existed. That's it. I had this strange phenomenon with my wife when she was pregnant. I was like, how do I love someone so much that I haven't even met yet? So I ask fathers all the time, like, I don't know, what did your what'd your son do to earn your love? Nothing. He was born. Okay, got it. So therefore, based on my worldview and what we're agreeing on, is that your son was born with this divine essence, this unique divine essence that did nothing to earn your love. And so that divine essence, as he builds his worldview, and my son and your son and all of us, this is just the human predicament. Some of that divine essence gets clouded, clogged, suffocated, suppressed, but it never goes away. You can bring it down to maybe a pilot light, but the pilot light never goes out. My job as a father is to constantly nurture that divine essence, to nurture that imagination, nurture that creativity, to nurture that unique spirit of his. Because I even ask fathers with twins, okay, they're both the same, born at the same time. Like, tell me they're the same. Like, they could be further. They're so unique. They're so different. They have different personalities, different sensitivities, different everything. So if that is true for our children, like, then the same is true for you. That divine essence may have gotten a little clouded, may have gotten a little suppressed, probably a little dinged up from time to time through some heartbreaks and disappointments and traumas and certain things that, just fundamentally went awry when you were younger. But that divine essence always is in you. And so that journey of authenticity isn't really like some version of you in the future. It's really actually that returning back to that divine essence. So as a father, of course, a role or of dynamicness is protecting him spiritually, physically, emotionally, financially, whatever. But a huge part of it is recognizing that he is his own person, that he is unique, that he has this divine essence that I get to cultivate and nurture. And that may look radically different than my own.
Yeah.
That may look radically different than his mother's. That may look just incredibly different than anything I've ever even seen before, but it's unique to him. And there's an old philosophy. I love this. I say this all the time. It's like, as fathers, I think fathering used to be woodworking, and now I think it's gardening. And with woodworking is like, okay, here's this block of wood. I need to shape it into something. The problem with that is like, here, listen, son, you need to become this. Well, that's a really, really narrow needle to thread, because if he doesn't become that, he just swims in a pool of disappointment. So I think we have made a jump from becoming woodworkers, that you need to become this. Whereas now, as gardeners, my job is to weed. My job is to water, to nurture, to make sure the environment is right, to make sure that that seed is set, to make sure it gets proper sunlight, to cut down any branches that are obstructing its view. And then here's the thing, then after I provide this environment, after I provide this garden bed, and every day I weed, every day I nurture, every day I water, every day I protect, then my job is to step back and have trust and faith in nature that that seed has its own destiny that is actually beyond his father's, it's beyond his mother's, it's beyond well past the legacy that I leave, and that once I'm gone, he is his own man. And my job is just to nurture that soil, nurture that seed, and work with nature and the divine intelligence of nature that me trying to force something isn't going to make that tree grow any faster.
Yeah.
Like, so my role as a father isn't to make him into something based on what I need. My role as a father is to make sure that the environment is safe enough that he gets to become what he was destined to become.
Okay. So it's beautiful. And I, as a stand-in in some way for the audience, and in some way, I think this will just be valuable for me. I hear the woodworking and gardening analogy, and I'm like, and I would say I'm really good at. I'm pretty much a gardener. I do a pretty good job of not. He needs to be an athlete, and he needs to go to Yale, and he's going to have a nice white collar job, etc. However, there are certain things that mean a lot to me, that they're maybe woodworker tendencies, and to be specific about that, the way that I eat is something that really matters. Like, for meats, we eat grass fed, grass finished, pasture raised, etc. I my wife and I have before she was even pregnant, like years before, had already had arguments about the ice cream dates that we would or would not have.
Sure.
And I'm wondering if there's specific things, whether it's in your life, clients' lives of men at large, that you think it actually is appropriate to be firm about. No, this is the way that we do things. It's not really in this moment. And maybe this is one of the ways to be dynamic, right? It isn't actually calling forth a gardening, and there are moments where being a woodworker is useful. So are there contexts that you find that to be true?
Yes. And I think they're in the power of language and distinguishing. And it's funny, I was just on a podcast a bit ago, and I was just distinguishing this is the importance of standards, boundaries, and agreements. And standards are values that I only demonstrate through my actions. They're between me and me. I very much like you. I have standards around food. I have standards around health. I have standards around how I speak. I have standards around what I watch. I have a lot of standards, and they're very high. But my standards are between me and me. And they're demonstrated, they're communicated through my demonstration and through my action. The next distinction are what are called boundaries. People get these confused all the time. Boundaries are values that are communicated through language, but they're still between me and me. So a healthy boundary my healthy boundary requires no change in your behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So if you and if you and I were on a road trip, which is maybe a bad example because we would never do this, but if I was on a road trip with someone and they wanted to go to a fast food restaurant, I'd be like, great, won't work for me, but by all means, go through the drive-through. I'm not trying to convert them, change their behavior at all. A boundary is set through my language and through my communication, but I'm not requiring anyone to change their behavior. An agreement is different. An agreement is a value that we communicate through requests, and it does require that we alter our behavior because there's a value to us. There's a value in my family. There's a value in the way we agree upon, how we raise our son, how we speak to each other, how we eat, all of it, how we spend our money, you name it. But as a gardener, don't forget that part of weeding and part of cultivating the soil is you demonstrating your standards, you living by your standards and your principles and your values, you communicating your boundaries effectively. And then also hold on, we don't do that here. In my house, we don't lie. In my house, we don't cheat. In my house, we don't demean people. Those are agreements. Those are blueprints. Those are ways that we navigate our family,
Yeah.
right? Like, we don't complain here. These are just ways we operate. So I don't consider that. I agree. I see where you're coming from. Like, woodworking. When I say a woodworker is like, you must become this.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there's standards that I live by, there's boundaries I live by, and then there's agreements that we have. And all of that is helping cultivate, my son and my nucleus to its optimum.
Mm.
And if I abandon those, I can't expect, my family to do things and operate in ways that I'm unwilling to do, or unwilling to evolve into and grow or exercise or commit to improving. So I think it's valuable that we distinguish those, because a lot of times people are like, well, I have high standards, you need to meet them. No, that's not a standard then. Or you're crossing my boundary. I'm like, well, then you're not communicating it effectively. Or like, you have agreements, and if those agreements aren't met, you're gonna build resentments. So we need to clean those up.
Yeah.
So I think it's important that I live by my standards and recognize that my standards are not for me to go grab a megaphone and stand out on my porch and convert people into, you need to live the way I do. Nope, my standards are between me and me. And I don't talk about them. I don't verbalize them. I just demonstrate them. That's
Yeah.
it. And that's part of, when my son is looking at me, he sees the way I treat his mother. He sees the way I speak to people. He sees the way I eat. He sees the way I treat my body or my health or my priorities. He'll see all that, because that's what I commit to demonstrating.
Hmm. I want to repeat them just so I internalize them, because I think it's such healthy, helpful distinction. So standards are the actions that I am demonstrating, and they're between me and me. And the example that you said is, if I choose to eat a certain way, that is not on another person to, that's just me being me,
So,
true to my standards. Boundaries is also, it requires nothing of another person, but it's basically an agreement with yourself, right? An agreement with yourself.
yeah, you're communicating with other people, but you're not requiring any altering of their behavior at all.
Like a good example would, I think a misused boundary might be, you need to get out of the
Correct.
room. And a healthy boundary is, I am going to remove myself from the situation, right?
That's a great example. Great way of putting it.
And then the last one, agreements are, verbally exchanged back and forth, shared upon between the two or more people.
Two
Yeah.
or more parties. Yeah. And it does require that we alter our behavior.
Yes.
There's certain things we do and certain things we don't do, because we made an agreement on it.
Yeah. It's really, really helpful. I love, and I was thinking, after I asked the question, you started talking more about it. There have been examples of where those three collapse into each other a little bit, where it becomes a demand, like you don't eat ice cream, it's a restriction. And I know, what do people do, let alone kids, when we feel restricted?
You just gave it extra value.
Extra value. It's the golden. So I remember, and my parents to this day will firmly stand by it, that their boundary was that I couldn't, which is not that's not a boundary based on what we've described. It was an agreement, an attempt at an agreement that I didn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't drink in this household, but to me it was an unreasonable agreement and restriction. And so what did I do? I threw multiple parties in my parents' house and drank a lot.
Now, and to that example, is a healthy agreement would have then been, if you choose to drink, there will be consequences to it. So therefore, if you have the right to choose to drink, but we get to make an agreement. We get to come to, what are the effects of this? What are the outlets of this? What are the consequences of this? And if you're in agreement to it, then by all means, drink all you want. But it is going to require that we we actually identify and alter our own behavior.
Mm. Well, to my
But
parents' credit, that was probably done.
you can't do this, automatically you're going to rebel against it.
I would say that they actually probably did move towards, like, they didn't say it quite that way as elegantly as you did, but there will be consequences if you do it was probably said. It's interesting that, like, it led to me wanting to, like, doing it and just being really good at concealing it.
Yeah, you just got crafty and clever. And I think one of my mentors, he gave me this, I guess, mantra or barometer. And I always loved it because it was, you just said the word and it made me think of it. Better to be commanding than demanding.
Mm.
And so, like, when in my book, I write, like, when the distinction I give is a man who's in possession of himself.
Yes.
Right? So when you're in possession of yourself, you're commanding. You can command a room. You can influence behavior. You can influence, the energy in the room. But you've got to be, you got to hold your own standards. You've got to be principled. You've got to be grounded. This is an ongoing evolution and demonstration over and over and over again, that your demonstration and your values and your standards and your boundaries, that you demonstrate them over and over again, that becomes commanding. People want to be part of that. That becomes electric and magnetic and charismatic. People want to match and mirror that. Demanding is, I'm unwilling to do it, but you need to. And people rebel against that. People, especially children, become demanding of your kids' behavior, and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, hold my beer. Watch, I'm just getting started." Right? But to be in possession of yourself, is to be commanding. That becomes enrolling and magnetic, and people want to be part of that, and that'll more effectively and sustainably influence than demanding things of others. And I always thought that was such a great distinction. You want to be commanding, not demanding. Leaders are commanding, tyrants are demanding.
And commanding and a man in possession of himself, it really ties back to, again, like, cleaning up your origin story, right?
Right. Correct.
Like, that feels like a huge, central focus of a lot of showing up authentically. It probably is the central focus in showing up authentically in your life, is just cleaning up the wounds of your origin story, right? I mean, there's more to it than that, but.
Well, I would say it's primary. Because I think there's so many people that are like, well, hold on, I don't want to deal with my point of origin. I just want a great now and a great future. And I'm like, okay, but there's so much upstream that's, like, polluting.
Not the way the psyche works, unfortunately.
It's a simple bumper sticker way of putting it. I'm sorry, that's just not the way the psyche works. It's a brilliant way of putting it. So it's essential and it's primary. Doesn't mean it's, like, forever. And I'm gonna, like I said, unpack and live there, but it's primary. I've got to have the courage to look upstream and into my point of origin to say, like, what is it from yesterday that's influencing me today? And I can guarantee that there are what are called life-defining events or life-defining dynamics that you're unconscious to that are influencing you now. Life-defining events are more of, like, the traumas and the disappointments and the heartbreaks where you're like, oh, at that moment in time when that happened, it fundamentally changed me internally. Life-defining dynamics are more of the relationships and the family dynamics and your cultural stories, your family stories, like when and where you were born and all those things that, like, they influence you because you normalize them.
Yeah.
It's just like a fish in water. Like, I guess this is what we do. I guess this is what parenthood looks like. I guess that's what marriage looks like. I guess this is what it means to be X, Y, or Z. So those are more what we pick up over time and then just normalize. If we don't have the courage to go back and at least challenge some of that, challenge some of those point of views and perspectives and conclusions and narratives and what I call distortions, then those distortions just run us. And then we wonder, like, why do I continue to self-sabotage? Or why do I keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome? And those patterns, those distortions become so practiced over time, they become so grooved and so familiar, they become our unconscious default. So unless I go back and I interrupt some of those patterns, I'm going to just keep creating the same thing over and over again. It's, again, unfortunately, that's not the way the psyche works. I wish it did, but
put it right on the bumper sticker again.
it really does. It's a great one. Yeah.
So this is, again, we spoke about this a little bit earlier. We were talking about cleanup, we were talking about repair, clearing conversations. But so I'm just thinking, if I project to when Nathan's 5 and I snap at him, I don't know, what do I think? I mean, patience is a really big one for me too. I actually, to this day, if I am running late for something, like if I'm scheduled to be somewhere at 2 and I know I'm going to get there at 2:07, there's all sorts of my rational capacities and faculties are highly dulled. Like I'm really, it feels like this really urgent. I could tell myself, yeah, it's not a big deal. I'm 7 minutes late, so I could call them. But my nervous system is going, oh my goodness, this is, and to me that comes from, it was very important in my family dynamic when I was growing up to be on time, that it was going to be met with, whether we were going to the airport or going to a party or whatever it was, like not being on time was a big deal and caused a lot of tension. And so it's all in there. I'm quite sure that while I am tending to that, I do have the courage to look back at that, and a specific way even that I might look back at that is to just ask, like, what did Michael need in that moment when he was 10 years old? Like, what did he need to hear? And it has less and less charge, but I imagine that at various times in Nathan's life, we're going to be running late for something, and I'm going to minorly or majorly start to get really frustrated with him. I feel like I know what your answer is, and I could probably just say it, but what does cleanup, repair, clearing look like there? And then another thing that we haven't spoken about is this layer of not self-flagellating and forgiving yourself. So I think that's another thing, like self-forgiveness when we inevitably fuck up sometimes, I think is really important too. I'm just wondering if you don't probably have that experience just yet, but I'm sure you think about it the way that I think about it sometimes.
Well, I think what's important to notice and become aware of overall is that your default to, always being on time, and if I'm not, then there's a narrative, or that means something about me. Over time, those develop what I call archetypes, like perfectionism or people pleasing or a victimhood or becoming controlling. Now, those at the heart of that, those are actually biological responses, like survival responses: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So there is a biological response in your nervous system to keep you alive. So that biological system is actually appropriate. Where the discernment comes is that I'm using an appropriate mechanism at an inappropriate time. So if my nervous system, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, is activated, that's actually a way of keeping you alive. It's the amygdala portion of the brain, the survival portion of the brain that makes things black and white: alive, dead. That's it. It's got one job: keep you alive. So it activates a lot of things in your nervous system. But to go from that biological system that we pick up when we're young, ultimately the way we pick it up is when we're building our worldview, especially with our parents, it's to gain or get love, attention, acceptance, affection, or approval. Certain things get it, certain ways I don't get it. And then those become our behaviors and things like that. Now, the genesis of those is actually a survival mechanism: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Your ability to distinguish in the moment, like, okay, I'm in a fight mechanism here, but I'm not actually under a life and death threat here. 2 o'clock and 2:07 is not a make or break life or death situation. Your ability to interrupt the biology and the psychology is massive. Massive.
Yeah.
Because the practiced biology, we just put more narratives on top of it. Oh, if I'm late, people are going to lose trust in me and I'm not going to respect me. And I'm like, bro, like, out of the 300 times we've met, you've been on time 299 of them. I think it's going to be okay if you hit a pothole and got a flat tire. Like, it's going to be okay. Right. So what happens here is like we've got to interrupt the biology from the psychology. And the biology is an appropriate mechanism. The psychology is an appropriate mechanism at an inappropriate time. The challenge is that the nervous system responds to an actual threat and a perceived threat the same way.
Mm-hmm.
So the more I practice that survival of like fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, which might look like people pleasing or, being perfect, make no mistakes, controlling. There's a whole bunch. I mean, there's a whole other podcast we could go into, but the more I default to that, the more I groove it and practice it. And I'm not distinguishing the moment. I'm not saying like, hey, you know what? 2 o'clock and 2:07 at the end of the day is probably not going to be a huge deal. So I could actually recognize like part of like my stress right now is like growing up. Like we couldn't be late to anything. All right, well, that was valuable to certain points. It's ineffective right now.
Mm-hmm.
And then I could just be like, hey, listen, son, I just also want to let you know it is important that we're on time. And we're late here. I own that. I was dancing around this morning and I lost track of time. I own it. Okay, great. Well, here we go. Distinguish it. It's a new moment.
Yeah.
So I don't want to just have one setting and default to like if I'm late, that means I'm a terrible person. Like I want to honor my word. I want to honor my effectiveness. I value being on time just the way you do. And here's the thing. Sometimes I drop the ball.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to find what's like the effective, healthy threshold. And so that's and I'll give you a barometer. Anytime you're making something black or white, you're in your survival portion of your brain. Anytime you're making something it's all this and none of that, you're in the survival portion of your brain. Anytime you're saying I'm right and they're wrong, you're in the survival portion of your brain.
Mm-hmm.
So your ability to pause and take a deep breath and zoom out and see it from a greater perspective actually shifts you from your sympathetic nervous system into your parasympathetic nervous system, and you can just more effectively navigate reality.
Yeah.
And that is an ongoing practice.
A hugely ongoing practice.
Huge. Because here's the thing, man, most of us have been practicing survival for decades.
Yes. Yeah. And a lot of, when you first get into the work, you've been practicing it your whole life. I mean, that's where a lot of men, black and white is where a lot of men that I know live.
Correct. And then like, wait a second, you're telling me that the way that I have it might not be the way that it is? I mean, that's a massive like rattle to your worldview.
Sense of self, all over the place there.
But the beauty of that is you could develop a whole new skill set.
Mm-hmm.
Even biologically, like we're designed to be at rest and then in stress and survival and then back to rest. But the way that our culture and society is designed is that we're always in this state of survival. And then every once in a while, we get to this point of rest and then back to survival. We're not designed that way. So many of us are just have this hypervigilance of survival that's creating this constant anxiety. And it's just not reality. It's not the way we're designed to live. If you think of like, you and I live in America. We're the wealthiest nation in all of human history at a time where it's not perfect, but it's one of the most peaceful times globally that we've ever had. And yet most of us are in a constant state of stress and anxiety.
Yeah.
And so it's like, that doesn't match reality, but it does match our programming.
Yes.
It matches our programming, and our programming is practiced. And that, like it was say, the practice doesn't make perfect, but practice does make predictable. And like most of us are just practicing this unconscious programming of survival. And we just don't realize we're just making it our default. So the next thing you know, we're yelling at the person in traffic. We're you're being cold to our wives in the hospital when our kid is sick. Like we're like self imploding because we didn't get a thank you, handing our wife a diaper. You're like, could I be any more absurd? Right? Because it's not matching our reality. But if you can, unclog those distortions, if you can, unobstruct all of that, like imagination and creativity and that divine essence and that authenticity that we were talking about, if you can unobstruct that, you start to, a big part of kind of waking up to reality is you realize like how absurd you've been living.
Yeah. So there's two things I want to add. I know that we're pushing up on time boundary here, and I've loved, as predicted, I've loved talking to you about fatherhood and your current worldview, man. But yeah, this distinction between our nervous system looking at perceived threats and true threats, and it's hard for our nervous system. It doesn't make the distinction, right? The perceived and true threats. Like for the example that was coming to me, you receive an email that you perceive as really nasty. Your nervous system is thinking that's a life or death, right? Like you go into a hyper reactivity in that moment. In the same way that our biology is wired for, if a saber-toothed tiger were approaching us, that we would be kicked into black and white. Let's get away. So we're being bombarded on a regular basis with things that our nervous system is perceiving as threats that aren't really threats. And so there's a lot of cleanup that can be done there, and there's a lot of boundaries that are helpful for that. And I was thinking this could be a really neat, it's not a story as much as an example, but a neat example to end the podcast is I once heard another coach on a podcast talking about how when there's a realization, like everything can change in an instant. And so there's an example of, let's just say me and my wife are in bed and we hear some rustling out in the, like the doors making some noise outside. Our nervous system might go into fight, flight, freeze, fawn right away there. So I'm like, I grab a flashlight, I start to weaponize get ready to, whatever the threat is, I'm going to make it go away.
Yeah.
If I go outside and have the realization that, oh, it was just the wind that was knocking the vacuum against the wall, my nervous system immediately has the realization that everything is safe, and I go right back into a parasympathetic state.
Correct.
And so a lot of the cleanup we can do with our point of origin and all the stuff that's blocking and clogging our way of actually authentically living today, when we have the realization, not just the insight, but like the deep embodied realization that everything's okay, it could change everything. And I was really feeling into that as you were talking about the example of it is okay. Even if someone screams in my face that I'm 7 minutes late, even that is like, okay.
But think about that. Think, like, what a great realization. Okay. Because if the nervous system is just a complex messaging system that is constantly communicating through your thoughts, emotions, and your physicality.
Mm-hmm.
So the nervous system is only responding to the messages. Well, if you want it to respond differently, you've got to send it new messages.
Yeah.
And we are so unconscious to the messages that we send with like narratives and stories and judgments and assumptions and perspectives and all this stuff, that it's actually just responding to the messages you keep sending it. So if you want to change the way it responds, you got to change its messaging. And your example is great. I go, okay, my nervous system puts me in a vigilant state. I go outside and then I tell the nervous system, hey, it's the wind. And then what does it do? It just responds to that message and then it calms down. Well, if 207 means I'm a bad person, then the nervous system is just going to respond to it. But if you say 2:07 means I'm late, and that's just, I can laugh about it, then the nervous system just responds to that messaging.
Mm.
It's just responding to the messaging. And to laugh about it and have the insight and have the awareness and see like the absurdity of my messaging is a really valuable tool, because I could actually just laugh at my perspectives and my assumptions and my judgments instead of being like, this is the end of the world. Well, if this is the end of the world, like, your nervous system's going to respond appropriately. Mm-hmm. There's something I do all the time, because we're like addicted to being right about our messaging. There's a tool I use all the time with myself and with guys I coach, is like every week I'll ask myself, what was the last thing I was wrong about? And it's not like going back into my point of origin. It's going back like a day or two. Like, I was like, oh man, I totally thought when I told you this, you were going to freak out on me, and you barely even flinched. Like, I was wrong about that. You know what? I was late, and it was 2:07. I thought everyone was going to laugh at me and point their finger and tell me what a bad person I am. I was totally wrong about that. There's a massive freedom that comes with it. Like, I was so wrong about that. Mm-hmm. And what that does is that starts to interrupt your assumptions going forward. Mm-hmm. Because we think like the next one is going to be the one that I'm really going to right about it. Like, that's the one that's going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. I'm like, do you know the trail behind you of how much shit you were wrong about is? Like, go acknowledge that. And this way you'll be less of a default to going forward. Like, I don't know, last time it was 2:07. Nobody even actually, everyone else was later than me. I was the first one. It was funny. I was marrying a friend of mine, and my wife and I were running late. And then I was like, "Oh my god!" And then we were there late, but no one else was there. And I was like, "Oh god!" And then my friend, humorously, after, I was like, "Oh, I should have told you that. Like, my family has never been on time for anything." Like, well, that would have been. I would have saved myself a lot of stress there. Like. So you start to laugh at your absurdity, because your absurdity is just like practice stress survival responses from, like, by the way, from like the 80s and 90s for you and I.
Yes.
He's just really, really good at it. You've practiced it a long time.
For 30 plus years, man. So
yeah, I got you on a decade.
Is there anything, Mike, that we haven't spoken about that you want to bring in for our boys or for other men out there?
Oh man, I mean, we could go on and on. I think that the last thing I'll say is really acknowledging you. I now that I have committed to an endeavor of like expanding my work and my mission and my platforms, and having like a podcast be one of those endeavors, I realize like it's a big endeavor. So for you, I think I was episode 1 on your podcast several years ago. For you to be in the hundreds, bro, I like really acknowledge that. That's no small feat. That's no small endeavor and task. So, the fact that you show up engaged and you show up meaningfully, man, like I want your viewers to know, like, that is not a small endeavor. I'm at the beginning of that endeavor, and I'm like, wow, anyone that's gone this deep into it has a massive amount of my respect. And I think it also blazes a trail for people too. Like, your gift and your platform and your skill set is unique than mine, is unique from the next person's, the next man, the next woman's. Like, just do what's authentic to you. If it lights you up, if you feel like it contributes, if you think it has value and impact in, one or a group of people's lives, do it. Who cares?
Yeah.
Like, at least it'll be a great channel and outlet of creativity. So I acknowledge you and the other men and women that are doing work that makes an impact, small and large, and just happy to be part of it with you.
Well, thank you, Mike. I appreciate the acknowledgement. You, no doubt, you're a very gifted communicator, and so your podcast, I'm sure, is going to impact many people. So your acknowledgement means the world to me, and anyone who's tuned in for the hour and 45 that we've been jamming together here, that means a lot to me too. I really appreciate you being here. I do show up really fully for these every single conversation. I cherish each one of them, and I know that today you probably got a lot of value out of this because Mike is one of the wisest and realest guys that I know. So thanks for spending all this time with us. Really appreciate you being here. Sending you all lots of love, and have a good rest of your day or night. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen to Mike's Search for Meaning. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, share this episode with your friends, and leave a review. I look forward to seeing you next time, my friends. And until then, stay safe, stay well, and keep living with purpose. Peace.